Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today's episode is a recording of an event that took place last week, in which I was joined by the BBC's chief international correspondent Lyse Doucet, historian and PPF regular Chris Clark, and the UN diplomat and writer Thant Myint-U, who's also been our guide on this podcast to America at War. And we were talking about the fate of democracy. The fate of democracy in broad historical perspective, but also the fate of democracy in this war. We recorded this event last Wednesday evening, and at the moment a week really is a long time in politics, in front of an audience of more than 600 people at Friends House in London. Friends House, the home of the Quakers. This event was jointly organised with the London Review of Books. 10 years ago in the LRB, I published an article which was called, "Is This How Democracy Ends?" It was about Donald Trump. And in that article, I said, Donald Trump is not how democracy ends. But that was 10 years ago. That was then, and this is now. And this conversation starts with now. Lyse, I think we need to start in the present, and then we're going to open it up to the future and also to the past. You were in Iran for the BBC last month, reporting on the aftermath of the brutal repression of popular protests there. So we're going to be talking about democracy. We're not going to get bogged down in definitions, but of course a lot depends on what we mean by that word. But I want to ask you, when you were there last month, what prospects, if any, did you feel there were for democracy in Iran? And what prospects do you think there are, if any, today?
What an honor it is to have this a really timely discussion of our time, when I think I speak for all of us that this is a time which has left many of us uneasy and anxious. So to join here tonight in the Friends House, the Quakers' House, the people who have always said no to war, it emphasizes, I think, the point that we would like to make tonight. So it's wonderful to gather here with all of you. And I will begin by saying there is an expression that has stayed with me since 2010, 2011, when there was this wave of protest across the Middle East and North Africa, which turned out to be erroneously described as the Arab Spring and then turned into some of the darkest times. But there was this slogan, I even have the T-shirt, "The power of the people is greater than the people in power." And how those young Egyptians, it was an Egyptian slogan, how they wanted to believe that power was theirs at that moment, that they could change their own history themselves by going out into the squares and peacefully demonstrating to unseat a president for life of 30 years. And for a moment, they believed that their dream came true. And yet we saw in Egypt, we saw in Syria, we saw later in Sudan, that power in reality often rests by those who have real power, brute power, the power of the army, the power of the police, the power of the intelligence services. And it also resides with those who are organized, who are ready for this moment where there's an opportunity to take power. And so it was in Egypt that it wasn't just the military, it was also the Muslim Brotherhood, which takes us to the question about Iran. That the people have neither power, and the people who took to the streets in large numbers yet again at the start of this year have not the leadership. Sometimes when you have these movements from the ground, they see being leaderless as an advantage because there's no one then whose head is above the parapet who can be killed. And there's no one who takes all of the responsibility for moving this movement forward. But in Iran, it has been a disadvantage. And they have every few years in Iran, and I've been there to see some of them, this rising of the people And when it was in 2009, and I was there then, the disputed presidential elections, because in Iran's clerical regime, they used to have real elections that despite the vetting by the Guardian Council, a clerical body, there were reformists and there were more hardliners who call themselves principalists. And in 2009, there was a choice between reformists and hardliners, but the hardliner won, and it was widely seen by those who voted as having been rigged. And so that was the protest where they went out into the streets, became known as the Green Revolution. And just as an aside, because if we believe that part of democracy is using the tools of democracy, using what at that time in the Arab Spring and in the Green Revolution, using platforms like Twitter and Facebook was seen as a force for good. And while we often say, well, it was the Arab Spring where young activists used Twitter and Facebook. It actually started in Iran, where they marshaled the power of the internet to organize, to galvanize, and to send their message to the world. So where is Iran now? The people who took to the streets to call for change, and I have to say, on this last visit, I was really, really struck by how Iran is a different country now. Struck by how raw the emotions were when we'd go out into the streets, to the squares, to the markets, and I kept my questions really general because I didn't know how much they felt they could say. What's your main worry? What's on your mind? And the outpouring stunned me. How people vented their anger, some broke down in tears. Of course, they did it when they knew that their identities would be saved, so it was easier to do for radio than for television. And for the first time ever since I've been going to Iran, and I've been going since 1988, there were some people, and of course you never know with random vox pops how much they're representative, saying, nobody wants their country to be attacked, but I think the only way we're going to get change in Iran is that there has to be an American airstrike. That's the only way that we can bring down the regime. Of course, there were others who defended the regime because it does have support, and there were others who were just anxious about war. So where is Iran now? It's the end of the 12th day of war. And even those who had called for war, including leading figures like Shireen Ebadi, the Nobel laureate, Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe, now they're saying, just a minute, we wanted something to bring about change, but we didn't want a war that is destroying our infrastructure, is hitting residential areas. Yes, there are police posts, but they're also hitting our homes. And so Iranians right now feel trapped, caught between the American-Israeli airstrikes and not knowing where they're going to go and how and when they will end, and the threats of their security forces who are saying to them, if you go out into the streets now, you will be treated as an enemy because you're doing it on the enemy's request. Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel keeps saying, go out, seize your moment, and you will be treated as an enemy, not a protester. This is a war where, and I know Sir Keir Starmer, former barrister, keeps being criticized for not joining the war, but here we are on the 12th day of war, and we are still discussing, why did this war start now? And what is the war about? And why didn't President Trump go to Congress to seek authorization? Why didn't he go to the UN Security Council as George W. Bush did? Okay, we can have lots of criticism of the US-led invasion of Iraq, but George W. Bush crisscrossed the country of the United States, took the megaphones of the world to make his case for war. President Trump didn't feel he had to. He didn't go to the UN. He didn't try to build a coalition. And I think, to quote Prime Minister Mark Carney, who has been talking about the rupture in our world, not a transition, a rupture. He described it as the most extreme example of a world order which is broken.
So we're going to come on to the question of the rupture, whether it is real and what we have moved from and what we're moving towards. But Thant, on that question of effectively, I think the word is the lawlessness of this war. Maybe all wars are lawless to some degree, but there is something about the brazenness of the lawlessness of this war, not just the disregard for international law, but as Lyse said also, the thing that's really struck me about the behavior of the Trump administration relative to even, say, the George W. Bush administration, is the lack of interest in securing public consent for this war. So there is a lot of interest in American public opinion turning against the administration because gas prices might go up. But the idea that at some basic level in a democracy, an event like this not everyone will agree with it, but an effort has to be made to win over people who might doubt it. Does this event feel to you like something not unprecedented, but a break even from the thin norms of the past?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a couple of things. I mean, one is, yes, I think, Trump is in some ways a gambler. He gambled from, a couple of weeks ago that this would be a quick excursion, an intervention that would pay off like Venezuela did in his estimation. But it's also something where I think what's different than perhaps past wars that the Americans have conducted in different parts of the world is the seeming kind of embrace of violence. And in a way, by him, by the Secretary of Defense, by others, that is outside the norm, even of recent American politics. If I could just take a step back, because it's about rupture and what Mark Carney said at Davos a few weeks ago, because I think perhaps we need a different frame. I think, there's a tendency to say the liberal international order, the rules-based order is collapsing. But I think in many ways, the liberal international order is something of the past 20, 30 years. It's a term that came up in the 1990s to describe a particular moment in history, which was very much dominated by the US militarily and very much dominated by global capitalism anchored in American markets and companies. I think this is related to the issue of where can democracy go around the world. It's related to the issue of peace as well, because I think a different framing, a very different framing, is not to think about a rules-based order or a liberal international order, but really to think about the post-1945 world as a world that was created by the UN Charter, by this radical commitment that was made at the time to a world without war. A UN that was then transformed in the 50s and the 60s by the newly decolonized countries of Asia and Africa, and their equal commitment to a world without empire. And I think we have to recognize that the world in which we live, which is a system of states based on sovereign equality of these states, is what I would argue has given us this unparalleled peace and prosperity for many countries since 1945, not the American domination since the 1990s and the liberal international order. So I think we should be worried more in some ways about what I see with the rise in war, with the rise in these tendencies towards empire, with the Russians in Ukraine, as well as what's happening now in the Middle East, of this rupture with that world that was created in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, that was based on these two radical commitments to a world without war and a world without empire. And I think both these things are fraying for different reasons right now.
So we'll come on to those reasons. Chris, do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on Iran and millions of miles away from being an expert on Iran, but I did spend with the film team 4 weeks making a documentary about the UNESCO World Cultural Heritage Sites back in 2019. So we're in places like Isfahan, Tabriz, and Shiraz.
Was it the
and so on.
BBC one?
No,
Oh.
it was for a German broadcast at ZDF. But we spoke with lots and lots of people. And what really struck me was exactly what you said, that I've never encountered a country where the people were so disconnected from the regime. And they weren't, just putting it on for us, or we spoke to endless people in all kinds of different situations. And it's a very different setting, for example, from Egypt, where I felt people were much more afraid of the government, much more constrained by the power structures around them. That wasn't the case with Iran. It felt like a free people in an unfree state. And so at first one might think, well, that's a promising situation for, the current moment. But if American and Israeli bombing were to, sort of bomb democracy into Iran, that would be the first time in world history. Bombing has not, by and large, been a very good way of achieving democracy. In the case of Germany, much more intensive and destructive bombing with huge, an enormous multiple of fatalities did not produce an alienation between the people and the regime. On the contrary, it produced a late blooming of the Nazi Party, which had lost its connection with a large part of the German population. And a lot of interesting recent studies show that there was a late flowering of the party in 1942, 43, 44, when the pressure really came on, because the party played a big role in helping people who'd been bombed out and so on. It returned to its original kind of social calling, its vocation. So there's every reason to fear that the law of unintended consequences will play out here as well. And it really worries me that people like Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe have changed their minds about this and are saying that they don't think this is the way to proceed. They're warning about the consequences of further violence against Iran. And of course, we need to remember what happened in 1979, which was a very successful revolution against the Shah, but one which had a fundamental flaw. There were many cracks in the coalition that ran this insurrection, and those cracks proved fatal to the achievement of democracy, as happened in 1848, another revolutionary situation where people had that feeling that you referred to in the Tahrir Square, that feeling that we are the people, we have the power. That feeling can be very, very fleeting. And once you're actually moved into a situation, either you suffer the slings and arrows of an outraged authority which simply beats you down, or you get into the vicinity of responsibility, and then everything starts to break up because people disagree. So I'm, at the moment, not especially optimistic, and I think it's a very disturbing situation currently unfolding in Iran.
Before we talk a bit more about the rupture and where we might be heading, I just want to ask all of you a question about regime change, because that was briefly the justification for this war from the Trump administration. It seems to have faded away as a justification, partly because it has become clear that decapitation is not regime change. The regime is something else. Given the kind of regime that exists and has existed in Iran since the revolution, what do you think are the conditions that would make regime change possible? It's not going to be bombed into the people, but given the kind of regime that exists, clearly for many people, a thing they want rid of, but which is much more than simply the leadership. You can kill the leadership group, you do not kill the regime. What are the conditions of regime change in a place like Iran?
Historians here would know better than I do that it's very unpredictable and often perilous when you have fervor on the streets meeting force from above. And I would think it would always depend on the circumstances at each place and time. But every time the people have risen up in Iran, and as I mentioned, it seems to happen every few years, then the buzz starts. Is this going to be the time? Is this going to be when they'll bring the regime down? A lot of us love to live in a world of wishful thinking, but unfortunately, wishful thinking sometimes collides with reality. And even in the last wave of unrest, which was nationwide, there were no mass defections and there were no cracks in the regime. So until it happens from above, you can't have something so consequential as regime change from below. And where we are now is President Trump, who did start by telling Iranians that after the bombing is finished, go out into the streets, seize the institutions, this is your best chance in generation. He has gone away from regime change to what he described as his perfect scenario, which is change in the regime. A Venezuela scenario, he said, would be perfect because he wants something, as Thant said, short, sharp, successful. He wants someone to deal with and that he can have a say in what happens in Iran. So even now, President Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, made this statement, which underlines that one of the great weaknesses of this great, let us say, American arrogance or exceptionalism is their failure to really understand other cultures, other societies, other histories. And Steve Witkoff said, President Trump is curious. Why haven't the Iranians capitulated? I've had such major buildup of U.S. military might, and they still haven't surrendered. To which, of course, then the Iranians put pictures of the Iranian flag on social media, and they're still asking it. So as we speak, there's still no sign of any cracks or any defections, whether some inside are hedging their bets, thinking, but so far the center is holding.
I don't know the Iran situation very well, but speaking on the, if I can say something on the Myanmar-Burma situation, which is comparable in some way, because there were protests, there were uprisings, many over the past few decades, none of them successful.
And Aung San, you have a leader there, Aung San Suu Kyi.
Had a leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, in the 1990s, flawed character in many different ways, but she was there in 1990s and 2000s. What worked eventually, to some extent, for 10 years at least, was not an uprising. It certainly wasn't an American intervention, but it was a shift within the elite. And that shift happened as sanctions were rolled back. So I would say as a general thing, when you put a country in isolation under crippling sanctions, in the hope perhaps that maximum pain might induce change or induce even a popular uprising, that relates to exactly what you were saying before, a complete lack of empathy for people, whether it's the elites or ordinary people in these countries, and an inability to understand that people in these countries, these non-Western countries in particular, also have the full range of human emotion, including pride and fear. And it's a misunderstanding or an inability to understand that or empathize with the situation there. And at least in the Burma situation, I think it's only when the lights were switched on, the country was less isolated, sanctions were being rolled back, that we saw differences within the elites, tensions within the elites, and an ability of some people within Myanmar, within Burma, to begin to play with that and try to push for reform in a sustainable way, at least over those few years.
Such a good point. That phrase, kill them with kindness. And there was that opportunity. It's a big what if. What if President Trump hadn't pulled out of the landmark nuclear deal in 2015, a multilateral weapons agreement? And when he pulled it out, then Iran went the other way, started enriching even more. That was meant to bring Iran into the international community rather than pushing it away.
I think what Lyse said about Witkov, this question, why aren't they just giving in? Reminded me of a moment in the Star Trek series that I remember in the 1970s, when Spock, who was the character I admired most, comments after there's been an exchange of fire with another spacecraft. Spock says, "Curious, Captain. When they witnessed the superiority of our weaponry, they should have fled immediately." And that's the Vulcan half of him speaking. And I have come to realize more recently that Spock is the kind of phantom presence of the rational actor who has, largely disappeared from social sciences. But the idea that people will behave rationally, if you show them enough power, they will buckle down. But of course, people don't behave rationally and they don't respond in that way, and they haven't in Iran, and they're unlikely to start doing so. And I think the other point that's interesting here is the one that David raised about the decision. How do you appraise a decision when you know so little about it? We know nothing about how this decision was reached. The motivation, as Lyse said, has been changing from hour to hour. There's been talk of regime change, then change within the regime. Unconditional surrender was a phrase which Trump picked up briefly and then dropped again. Presumably it was offered to him by someone in his entourage. So we don't have any idea of the true motivation, the reasoning behind this. It also hasn't been procedurally legitimate in the sense that it's been ratified by some process of consultation, let alone through Congress. And of course, the other way to judge a decision can be very badly made, but nevertheless be a good decision in the sense that it produces good outcomes. But we have no idea what the outcomes are going to be. A knowledge of the future is not vouchsafed, even to historians, perhaps even less to historians than anybody else. So we don't have any way really of appraising it. That's part of what is worrying about this situation.
And Thant, you said we should be more concerned that an order that is longer than just the last 30 years, it's the post-Second World War order, may be unraveling. And the word you used to underpin that order was peace, essentially, the absence of war. So one of the questions about this war for me, given everything that Chris said, the uncertainty of the motivation, the uncertainty of the reasoning, the uncertainty of the outcome, and also that fact that American democracy is working in a somewhat unpredictable way, in the sense that even a system which gives the president extraordinary war-making powers, nonetheless, in this administration, seems not to be behaving as you might expect. There is almost no pushback from his party. Congress has been sidelined. And like I say, public opinion is being treated like a sort of walk-on part in this thing. Pete Hesketh gives these extraordinary, if you haven't watched them, do watch them, extraordinary press conferences in which he talks to the room, and the room here is the people of the United States, like they were children. In that context, what does peace mean? So when you think about the possibility that we're moving away from an order that's organized around the absence of war, my fear is I don't know what peace means in this context.
And if I could just add, some parts of the post-1940 world order
were not peaceful.
Yeah,
exactly.
And we're totally imbalanced.
Yeah.
And it's great that they've changed, because they were good for some countries, but very bad for others.
Exactly.
And the Security Council is the best symbol of that.
I mean, Trump is he's a temporary phenomenon.
Is he?
Well, he's temporary. He's not going to last forever. He's not going to live forever.
But do you think Trumpism is here?
I think what's really interesting is on the U.S. side, we see this huge shift in American opinion as well. I mean, towards the Palestinians, towards Israel. We see even now within the MAGA movement differences of opinion. So we'll see what happens in America electorally, also with the midterms and afterwards. But again, to look at the sort of broader framing, I think it's not just peace, it's also empire is really important. And I think the reason that the UN was successful for a time, for many decades, and when I say successful, the core objective of the UN in 1945 was to prevent World War III. Harry Truman, I think it was in 1945 or 46, said he hoped that the UN would be able to do its job and survive for 90 years. which means we have about 10 years left. But it prevented World War III, or at least World War III has been prevented. And I think it was based on two things. It was, again, these radical commitments of a world without war and a world without empire. The second wasn't part of the initial framing of the UN or something that the founders of the UN really thought about, but it was something that was a central ambition and central focus of these newly independent countries. And I think sitting here in the UK or anywhere in the West, we tend to think of 20th century history as history of World War I, World War II, Cold War, post-Cold War. But for the majority of people in the world, the history of the 20th century is the history of empire and post-empire. And this enormous transition to post-empire through bloody fighting as well as through peaceful transitions and creating this system of sovereign states, I would argue, is a huge part of this world, despite all the different wars that we've seen from Algeria and Suez and Vietnam to today, has been largely successful in many ways for many billions of people. And that is what's fraying. And I think it's fraying as a proximate immediate cause, perhaps by the policies of people like Donald Trump, or certainly. But I think the broader thing, and we can talk about this more if you want, I think the broader thing is also an issue of memory. And I think that we are living now in a time where we've lost that living connection to people who've experienced, not in places like the Congo or in Sudan, but in the rich countries, to war, to that generation of people who fought for independence from empire as well.
Yeah, in particular, the countries of the Security Council, which are countries which experienced World War and where that memory of an extraordinarily brutal conflict, unprecedented really in world history, sat in their bones. It's not something that you had to make arguments for.
Exactly.
If you think about Konrad Adenauer saying, the West German Chancellor saying in 1952, peace isn't everything, but without peace, everything is nothing. Now, he was saying that to people who absolutely understood what he meant, because he was a citizen of a country which had experienced war in its most ferocious form. But the same applied to the Russians, the Americans, the Chinese. But that memory, as you say, the memory is not eternal. There's a half-life, and it's clearly waning.
And I would just add that, I think being back here in the UK now for 4 years, it strikes me that World War II, if anything, is seen as a triumph rather than being remembered also as a catastrophe, which it was back in the 50s and 60s in much of the world. I think the central question going forward, in a way, is, in 1945, people believed that peace had to be organized in some way. And this is the question, does it still need to be organized? And who's going to organize? And is that architecture that we still have at the UN in any way fit for purpose going forward?
Can I be a rude journalist? You wrote the article, which then became the book, and you're sitting here asking us questions. So I'm afraid I'm going to rip the page up and I'm going to bring you into the conversation because we're talking about the fraying. We're talking about the unraveling. And it would be remiss of us when we gather in the Quaker's house not to leave everyone here with a little bit of hope. And I hope you will give us a bit of hope. But is this unraveling like a ball of wool that we can actually wind it up again? And will it ever be the same if America, the land of the free and the home of the brave, doesn't come back to the rules, to the norms that we all felt we took for granted? Can we go back to what it was, or at least something that we can all recognize as the values and principles we'd like to live by?
So that is not the question to ask if you want to leave people with hope.
Oh, okay. Can you just do a version? Do a version of it.
So let me say two things. One thing about that, and then another thing to open it up more broadly into a discussion of democracy. The article I wrote in 2016 essentially said Donald Trump is not how democracy ends. And the book that I wrote, How Democracy Ends, should have been called This Is Not How Democracy Ends. And I smugly thought in 2020, even in 2021, even after Trump encouraged people to reject the results of a fair election, but nonetheless left office, and there was no question that he wouldn't leave office, that indeed the system had somewhat restored itself and that this was an interlude and it had shaken some of the foundations, but it hadn't cracked them wide open. I don't think that now. And I think Trump 2.0 is a completely different category of event in American political history than the first administration. And I think we are seeing the fruits of that now. And it's not simply, as many people pointed out, this time he had time to prepare, talking about regime change. I mean, in a sense, we are now seeing this time around something much more organized. It was leaderless in Trump 1.0 because he sure wasn't a leader. He was just a figurehead, which is not being a leader. This time, he's still a figurehead, but there's also quite clearly a new appetite, as Thant said, for risk in this administration. Now, does this have to do with his age? Does it have to do with the fact that he isn't able to run again, and I don't think will run again? Traditionally, post the midterms, which he is going to lose, we would call his presidency a lame duck presidency. I think one of the ways you can feel this is a new world is there is no reason to be confident that Donald Trump in the final 2 years of his presidency will behave like a lame duck, because that depends on having a sense of continuity, institutional, party, loyalty, not just to your person, but to the organizations to which you belong, that this will outlive you. So I think the American case now is genuinely frightening. Having said that, I think it's a mistake to think that what's happening in the United States is the story of democracy. And I think, though it is the world's leading democracy, or it was until 2024, I think that there are things happening in our world which go way beyond the United States and which don't all point in one direction. So I think we are simultaneously living in a world that is clearly becoming less democratic, more autocratic, and not simply because there are more autocratic regimes and some of the world's democracies are becoming more autocratic, but also because we live in a world in which certain corporations have enormous amounts of power, and we tend to forget that those corporations are autocracies too. In fact, they are effectively personal dictatorships. There is very, very little democracy inside the biggest technology companies, probably less democracy inside those companies than within the Chinese political system. So many of the most powerful organizations in the world are becoming rapidly less democratic. And at the same time, I think the world we're living in is becoming more democratic. There is greater personal empowerment. This technology, we tend to think it all went wrong because we had great democratic hopes for it and they weren't fulfilled. But this technology is astonishing in the way that it empowers citizens to do things for themselves. They often choose to do these things outside of conventional party politics. But nonetheless, these two forces are at work at the same time. Less democracy, more democracy. I think it is possible that liberal democracy will get squeezed, that the liberal democracies are not democratic enough for the democratic parts of our world. And in a way, they are too slow, too democratic, too consultative for a world in which they have to take on the big tech companies. But whatever that story is, it is not a story either simply of the United States or of democracy ending.
I find that very persuasive, especially what you say about the difference between Trump 1 and Trump 2. But could I push back a little bit? Because, I mean, it seems to me that you could say democracy in Trump's America is in rude health. It's not a democracy we like. It's a populist variant of democracy. But democracy is doing pretty well. It's doing pretty well in Hungary. It produced Orban and his noxious form of governance. It gave rise to MAGA movement. It's all eminently democratic. What it isn't is liberal. And I think we need to cut these two Siamese twins and separate them, because it seems to me what Trump is really attacking is not democracy as such, something on which he thrives, but rather he's attacking the instruments of oversight. He's attacking anything which enables people to know where his family gets its money from, has been disabled or weakened in the American Constitution, other parts of the American system. Regulatory bodies have been weakened. This is very systematic, whether it's environmental or, again, to do with fiscal questions or financial transfers and so on. The reckless invocation of emergency powers, the disregard for the legislature, the fact during the first 100 days he issued more executive orders than any other president, with the exception perhaps of Roosevelt during the Second World War. But he's also produced fewer bills than any other president. 5, I think, in total bills were sent to Congress. So it's not that democracy's not working. Democracy's buzzing away at a very high rate of revs. It's we can call it liberalism if you like, but liberal is now such an emptied out, destroyed word. It's been ruined by the American use of the word to mean simply leftist or far left or anti-far or whatever they mean by it. But liberalism is in fact a creed which operates around the idea of representative politics, accountability, transparency, regular elections, and so on. It's about representation. And it seems to me, unless democracy has that, democracy is pretty useless. It's an empty formula. We need this other thing, which you can call simply accountable government or responsible government, or you can call it liberal democracy if you like. But that's what's under threat, not democracy as such.
And in a way, I think that's what I mean by saying this world is getting more democratic and less democratic.
Yeah.
Part of the more democratic is it is more responsive to popular anger.
Yeah, and I think that's why in some ways, I mean, what happens these coming few weeks are so important. Because if the outcome is that Trump is able to spin it, I mean, he will always try to spin it as a victory. But if the American people buy that he's been successful in some way, and then he goes on to Cuba, he goes on to other countries, that's one future world. But if this is seen by the American people, by parts of the MAGA movement, by Democrats obviously, but by the ordinary voter, as having been this useless, senseless failure, then I think American politics might shift over the coming months towards the midterms if it has an impact on the economy and everything else. Because we all remember, I mean, one of the biggest promises that Donald Trump made was no more war. And we also know that for most American people, the number one issue is the economy. So if there's an impact on the economy, he's seen as having started another war, that will have a devastating effect on his politics going forward. But let me connect this back to Burma for one reason. And this goes to technology and Facebook and everything else as well, which is that in Burma as well, in the 2010s, people felt in this brief moment of democratic opening really empowered. So when I arrived in Burma in 2010, a SIM card cost $1,000. Within a few years, there had been a revolution in telecoms because of investments coming in from the outside, and where you could get 5G wireless for nothing. And the country went from having maybe 2% of people on telephones to 85% of people on 5G, 4G, 5G wireless. And people felt empowered. There was this huge sort of blossoming of civil society organizations and everything else. But what happened was there was still a hollowing out of that democratic moment because people still had no real authority over their economic futures. Because at the same time that they felt more empowered, this global system of these big companies, but also just the global economic system as it was, began restraining whatever economic choices they really had. And the big international organizations and others coming in basically said these economic issues are technocratic issues. We'll fix the central bank. We'll fix the Ministry of Finance. So people couldn't even talk about the things that actually mattered most to them in terms of their own economic future. And so there's a strange parallel, I think, happening in the West on the part of ordinary people with things that people in what used to be called the third world have been feeling all along, which is, one of the first questions that these countries, when they became independent in the 1950s, asked at the UN was, are we really independent if British and French companies still control our economies? Are we still independent if we don't change the entire global economic system? And so for them, democracy was intimately related with a system of sovereign equality, which in turn was intimately related with the transformation of the global economy.
It's such a good point because what we saw was in the wake of the US-led intervention into Iraq in 2003 and also US-led intervention in Afghanistan after the September 11th attacks was this idea that, okay, democracy, let's have elections. Let's have elections, even though the countries weren't prepared for elections, even though the elections elected the wrong people, because people, again, for these societies steeped in these principles and of democracy, didn't really understand democracy after all. They went to those countries to impose democracy with a very, very, very weak, in fact, distorted understanding of democracy. I'm just going to drop a little thought into here, and I don't want to seem Pollyannish or naive, but I am going to go back to that slogan that I still hold on to. I've still got that T-shirt. The power of the people is greater than those in power. And I'm really struck when I go to the United States. I don't go there often for work, but say in September when I was there, I met people, including professors at Princeton and Yale, who would say, well, there's not going to be any midterms. And I would say, what? No midterms? Yeah, Trump's going to cancel, he's going to invoke. But equally, I met so many people in different walks of life who described themselves as being part of the resistance. And I think we have to remember, because I think this conversation is heading toward a little bit of resignation, of accepting what's happening from above, either by for those who are monopolizing political power through either brute political force or because they're the tech brothers and they have untold millions, even trillions. But so many people don't want to sit down and take this for granted. Well, if we all give in and give up, then the bad guys are going to win. And not to fight at all is not to say, just a minute, this matters. is a complete surrendering of the capacities we have as individuals. I'm not trying to say that we can sort of, take on these huge powers, but people look for perhaps it's just one small little light in a very particular place, Zoran Mamdani in New York. Suddenly people say, oh, there it is, where a very different political figure marshaled the energy and power and the courage of people and came up with a different result. And I was so struck that day that Zoran Mamdani went to see President Trump. The expression on his face, meeting someone who didn't go to pander, didn't bring a gift, didn't want to give in to him, and Trump looked like a child in a candy shop. Did you see that? Did you see that image? He looked so happy because there wasn't any fear there. Zoran Mamdani didn't want to fear. And I'm not saying I'm not a democratic socialist. I'm just using that. I just want to put a little drop of not leaving tonight thinking, well, we may as well just give up.
In a way, then the question is, given what Chris said about the thing that's really under threat is the liberal part of liberal democracy. And that includes some of the boring stuff like constitutionality and procedure and oversight. How you channel the democratic energy that you're talking about, I think I'm talking about too, back in that direction. Because I do think one of the dangers of our world is that there is a real hunger for democratic empowerment. And there are real opportunities for democratic empowerment. But the opportunities are being offered to people by people who don't believe in democracy. And that includes both the people who run the big tech companies and, frankly, the leaders of some of the world's biggest states. In fact, maybe the leaders of all the world's biggest states. So how to avoid liberal democracy being the thing that gets squeezed in this world as the resistance goes round it this way and autocracy goes round it this way? How do you drag it back into the liberal democratic space?
Well, first of all, I like the idea of empowerment, but of course, empowerment has to mean, among other things, the power to discipline, real power, to discipline political power. If you don't have that and you're just empowering yourself to communicate with more and more people about your favorite summer knitwear or something like that, that's not a check on executive caprice. One way to do this is to remind ourselves that each other. The thing is, liberalism is now such a discredited word, and it's been discredited from the right to mean faddish, leftish obsessions, and from the left to mean neoliberalism. But what liberalism really is the choice of those, it began as the choice of those who didn't want to live under Robespierre and the Republic of Virtue, or Napoleon for that matter, and on the other hand, didn't want to live under an absolute monarchy. They wanted something in between. They wanted a system which would mediate between different interests. They understood that society was complex. It was never going to be possible to impose on everybody the same codex of virtue, the same values. And that means that the liberals were always, you mentioned them being squeezed. They've always been squeezed. That's their job, to be squeezed from the left and from the right. The left say, well, if we restructure enough, conflict will stop. And the right say, get back into your hierarchies, be respectful of authority, and the problems will go away. Only the liberals always said the problems will never go away because complex societies will always be in conflict with themselves. And we need to find ways of mediating those conflicts which are not violent, which are discursive. And that's when you get to the boring stuff. Complicated rules about who is allowed to speak when. In Parliament, for example, complicated laws around elections and the establishment of new parliaments or their dissolution. All these things are part of that system. So, we need to somehow, perhaps we need to dump the word liberalism. It's not a very good word because, of course, liberalism can also refer to parties which, represent the better off at the expense of everybody else. That's not the liberalism that I'm referring to. So in other words, I think we need to replenish our sense of where this came from, why it was so necessary, and what it did for us.
But does that mean that the anomaly for us is we were almost uniquely in the history of this liberal experiment, people who lived during a time when we didn't realize the job of liberalism was to be squeezed? We thought we were living in an age where liberalism had won. And we are learning, if you are right, and I'm sure you are right, that it can't win, because the point is it's always pushing against these other forces.
Well, it can only win by keeping on doing that.
Right, but it can't win. It can just keep going. We fell into the trap of thinking that something about this way of doing politics had been settled. Is that our mistake?
No, because I think it's still, in my view, and this comes back to what Lyse was saying about trying to get a bit more positive, I still think it's an absolutely indispensable gift to humanity. Whatever you call it, let's not call it liberalism, let's call it responsible government. The idea that governments have to ask the people's permission to form themselves and then to do something, and then the people have to be asked to ratify or at least to pronounce on these decisions. And it's not just the people, it's also the structures of the state, the judiciary. It's a complex system, as we all know. And it seems to me that that is something whose value we need to reacquaint ourselves with.
I'm not saying it's not a great idea. I'm saying we lived during a time where we thought it was an idea that more or less sorted itself
that's
out
true.
without
Yeah.
having to be fought for.
Yeah, it does have to be fought for.
So, Thant, I want to go back to something you said earlier on, which is we, say in Britain, see the story of the last 100 years as a world war, another world war, a Cold War, a post-Cold War order. For much of the world, it is the story of the order of empire and then post-empire.
Mhm.
And the question is possibly, is the post-empire period coming to an end? Or at least is it starting to unravel? If it is, one possibility means that we're going back. The thing that comes after post-empire is empire. Another possibility is that actually we're entering something quite new. What comes after post-empire is post-empire. We don't know what that is. Do you think if this is unraveling, we're going back to empire, or do you think there may be something else?
I think that the period since 1945 has been this really uneven process where, of course, big empires, Atlantic empires, have been dismantled. But we've seen wars through the 1960s, 70s, 80s. We had apartheid in South Africa until the 1990s. And then we see all these new interventions under the guise of humanitarian intervention that have kind of empire-like qualities about them as well. And now we have these new wars as well in the Middle East, but also with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I think looking at it from that point of view, in a way you could say nothing has changed that much. We are still in this world of an unfinished post-imperial settlement, and we don't really know what is that global system that is possible in the aftermath of that. On the other hand, I think we can say we've seen this big spike in war over the past few years, and we seem to see this kind of return to at least some of the instincts of empire. And that's why I go back to this point of, we are at this critical juncture. How these coming weeks, months turn out, I think are going to be really important in many different ways. But the point that I would want to make as well is that, when we think about democracy, liberal democracy in the UK, in the West, is that it's really important in the same way that I think people in empire countries 50, 100 years ago thought, that they could not think about democracy in their country alone. They had to also have a vision for what is that world system within which that democracy was possible. And I think it's really important for people in the UK, but elsewhere, to also have a new vision, because it's not really about east, west, north, south anymore. I think with technology and everything else, if democracy is going to have a chance anywhere in the world, I think it has to be part of a shared vision as well for what that peaceful and more equal global system is going to be. And I think that discourse, that set of discussions, has been largely missing.
We're focusing quite a bit on it, and as we should. Thanks for that. We're not completely focusing on Western societies. And I just want to make a comment. I spent 5 years in West Africa in the 1980s, where there were a lot of military coups, and where, again, people were still grappling with how to move from independence, from empire, to new political systems, a form of democracy, a form of representation. And in the 80s, there were all these military coups. And fast forward to where we are now, how many presidents for life there still are in Africa? Yoweri Museveni, still in power, and the person expected to replace him is his son, who's a leading military person. And when even Tanzania, when I went to university in Canada, Julius Nyerere, the leader of Tanzania then, small is beautiful, he was admired for his ideas on democracy. Even there, where people voted and then the election seemed to have been rigged, people took to the streets in protest, there was violence. And I'm just thinking, even the bright lights like Ghana, Nigeria, there's also troubling trends in other parts of the world as well. And there's no easy explanation. Your post-empire is not working out in many parts of Africa. And there's a whole generation of young Africans, really educated, really aspirational, wanting a different kind of life, trying to fuel the economy, and then being met by such disappointment by their leaders and the corruption on an industrial scale.
No, I agree. And I think that, in the 60s and 70s, when a lot of these countries first became independent, there was an enormous amount of hope and ambition. And many people wanted their countries to be democracies. There are many reasons why that didn't happen in some of these countries. A lot of it had to do with continued intervention from Europe and from the United States.
Yes.
Many of the coups were supported by the United States and the overthrow of many of these
French
people, or the French or other countries as well. But, fast forward to the past decade or two, and I think, looking back again at the Burma case, a lot of it has to do with the system, the global economic system, the technologies from the outside, the different ways in which the outside dynamics interact with domestic dynamics that make it really hard for democracy, which is going to be very difficult anyway in a poor country to succeed, from being 10 times less likely to succeed. So I think there is that aspect of it. But in a way, it's not just for these poor countries, because I think the same kinds of issues are now connected in Western democracies as well. So I think all of these things that we've been talking about, peace, democracy, global system and global economic system, I think they're all interrelated.
But can I ask you, are you saying that therefore in the end what we need is an idea that we haven't heard about for a long time, but used to be something that people talked about a lot in the first half of the 20th century, which is a global political system? Do we need a global democracy? Because if it is as hard as we are suggesting it has become, particularly for poorer and smaller countries to achieve democratic stability in this world, it needs to be integrated. Does the integration itself have to be political?
I think we're forgetting, the steps along the way. So I think the idea was always, and I think this is right, and the idea back in the mid-20th century by a lot of these countries, but also many people in the UK and elsewhere, is first we need peace. We need a peaceful world. And we cannot leave it to a new concert of powers. We cannot leave it just to the British, to the Americans and the Soviets to kind of have a good relationship, or they're going to blow the world up. We have to have some organization. We have to have some architecture of peace. And once you had that, by the 1960s and 70s, there was this idea that we have to transform the global economic system in the right way, or else all of these gains in terms of the post-empire transitions towards more democratic government, all these things will be under threat. So I think we're in danger of not remembering how important those transitions were, and then thinking that all that is being imperiled today is this liberal international order post-1990.
And isn't there also the danger that, Western liberal internationalists will come to think that one recipe works for everybody? I mean, that's one of the huge criticisms made of the kind of self-aggrandizing liberal democratic vision, that this is supposedly a
one size fits all.
One size fits all. And I recall, I have no time. I mean, Putin is a repellent figure in so many different ways. But after the attack on Libya, the airstrikes on Libya in 2011, Putin said that the West has lost sight of the fact that there are different kinds of countries, different kinds of political cultures in the world. Not everybody wants to be in a liberal democracy. That doesn't mean that we don't. Obviously, as far as I'm concerned, it's as important as oxygen. I mean, I wouldn't want to be in any other kind of system, but that is not necessarily an argument for forcing everybody to accept it. We should lead by example, or try and persuade by example, it seems to me.
You remember when Joe Biden came to office, right from the get-go, his main battle, he said it's a battle between democracies and authoritarian states. And he made this his overriding ambition to be able to prove to the world that democracy was by far the better system. And of course, the Chinese looked on. And then fast forward to where we are now, and almost every major newspaper is about how the strongmen are winning, that the authoritarian rule, that democracy is under real challenge and is dying in many ways. But I always remember that Joe Biden made that his big battle. But don't forget, President Trump has an answer for everything, and he set up the Board of Peace. And then he became bored of peace and went to war.
And he did win the FIFA Peace Prize. So let's hope.
You used the word brazenness before, which I thought was interesting, because there is a brazen quality to Trump's public persona, and also Hegseth and many of the others. They're saying stuff that under Biden and nobody in any previous administration would have felt free to say. And I think a lot of people, we mustn't forget this, a lot of people find that refreshing.
Yes, they do.
At least this guy is not a fake. He's honest. He's saying it like it is.
Saying the quiet part out loud.
That's right. And that seems to them to be unhypocritical. One point that you can make in defense of hypocrisy is hypocrisy happens when you do feel that you are obligated to a set of norms, to a set of values, but you also know that you don't fully fulfill the demands of those norms. You never do it. You honor them in the breach, just as every clergy person honors their religious injunctions in the breach, or not 100%, let's say it that way. And that produces hypocritical situations where you are standing in for an order that you can't fully personify. And that's a good thing. It's actually good for liberal and democratic and free political societies. Hypocrisy is part of it comes with the territory. And this brazenness comes with authoritarianism. So it's not refreshing, it's actually brutal and repellent. And I hope people will soon see through it.
I mean, Trump is doing us a service in that we all hate hypocrisy, but he's giving us a glimpse of what a world without hypocrisy looks like. And that's worth.
Exactly.
Thank you. I want to build on the point that I think Christopher was making about supposing we return to a situation where the tools of democracy are in place and we have cut the kinds of democracy we want. Still, can I broaden out the question to say, how do we deal with wider problems, not just war, not just different nation states, but how the nation state deals with AI, climate change, things that are global, not nation state based, and how does democracy tackle them?
Thank you. In a recent book, the historian and philosopher Rutger Bregman talked about the ability of very small groups or individuals to choose the moment to somehow pivot society towards greater social justice. You mentioned Bandari in New York. Are there other examples that the panel have got of people who might work with revitalized, more relevant United Nations in a world that recognizes that peace is more than simply the absence of war?
I think it has to start with small groups of individuals, because I think the wrong way to think about revitalizing the UN or anything about the UN is to look at a top-down kind of institutional reform. Ever since 1945, that's when the first UN reform discussions happened. The architecture was always broken. It was never really fit for the world that was unfolding, but people made it work in different ways. I think right now you have a UN which is trying to do everything in different ways. And to go back to that question about global cooperation on issues like climate and AI, I think the question we have to ask ourselves is, for which issue do you need a universal body which has 190 plus member states? It's a government body. Is that the right way to try to achieve an effective outcome? Or for some issues, it's better to handle it in a different way, through civil society, through maybe just a group of countries, or in some other way. There's never been a firm accounting of what is the UN really good for and what is it not good for. I think the one thing it is good for, it should be good for, is situations like now, where you sometimes need a UN Secretary General who is an impartial mediator, chosen by the entire world, with good relations with all the big powers, who can find face-saving, behind-the-scenes de-escalation mechanisms to try to move people away from an escalatory ladder, which is what we see at the moment when they feel exhausted or feel that they need to kind of back away a little bit from the brink. And the UN used to do this well, but it doesn't. But to go back to your question, I think the question is not how do we change the UN? For me, the question is how do we make up for that lost memory? How do we make up for the fact that we have so many millions, hundreds of millions of young people especially, who've not only never lived through war and empire, but were never even surrounded as we were by parents, grandparents who were, and who didn't grow up in an era where there was civic education on this, there was the drills around possible nuclear war. How do we make up for that? And I think that has to come from the public, and that has to come from individual people. We don't have to wait for Washington or Moscow or Beijing. I think that has to come from the general public.
Lyse, do you want to say something about China? Because we haven't talked about China.
I'm not a China expert, but China has been quietly trying, and not so quietly, trying to take advantage of the US's retreat from power back to the United Nations. And Thant will know this more than I do, how much China now is dominating some of the institutions, including peacekeeping, where I think they are one of the largest contributors. And sometimes you get speeches by Xi Jinping that you think would have been made by an American president before, he talks about the rules of the international order. He talks about peace. He talks about non-intervention in societies. So they have tried to capitalize on this moment because they've now come where they no longer call themselves as a developing economy. They are now a world power competing with the United States on the economy, politically, etc. And they must be, what is that great British expression, barely concealed glee to see President Trump running roughshod over the rules of war and having seen Vladimir Putin get away with it, that Taiwan will be next. That they think, well, if everyone else is doing it, we can do it too. And there are often many assessments, and again, this is best done by China experts, that the real winner in all of this is Xi Jinping. with one of the most undemocratic systems in the world. He wants to make the point that his system is better in lifting people out of poverty. I remember in Iran, they used to talk about this model to say that you suppress people's political space, but you give them lots of space to get rich, to pursue their economic futures, to have personal freedoms, and to forget about politics, leave politics to the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party. And there are some societies where that works façon a little bit. It's not what we'd want, perhaps, but
And if you have a history like the history of China, where you have the very stark alternative between, states which were quite strong and provided security and freedom from civil strife, and on the other hand, episodes of extremely violent dislocation, enormously costly in human lives, well, you can understand, you can put yourself in a situation where those arguments would make some sense. But I thought that it was very interesting, the point that was made over here about the challenges posed by AI and climate change and other problems of that ilk, of that order of magnitude for democracies. I think they don't only pose problems for democracies. I mean, autocracies and authoritarianisms also fail to deal with them. In fact, they're even worse at dealing with them than the democracies have been. And the problem is, it seems to me, that was a very interesting question to me, because historically, the emergence of strong states has often been about how states master emergencies. And in handling emergencies and threats, they acquire the power to tax, the power to run an army, the power to, solve these problems in future. They develop a sort of preemptive posture towards the future, in return for which people give them power and authority. But the reason that was possible is because the emergencies used to be smaller than the states. But now we have an emergency which is global, several emergencies which are global in scale, all happening at the same time, and they cannot be addressed by any single state. They make a nonsense of our situation of distributed executive powers. There's no obvious answer to this, except to say that, there are, among democratic countries, there are some communities which have found partial solutions, just the beginnings of solutions. If you think about environmental law in the EU, for example, that would be one example. But I think it's true, and this comes back to a point that we talked about before, that the democracies do have to think. You can't simply be a democracy alone. It can't just be a friendless world where you're just, somehow muddling through. Democracies need to have democratic friends, and they need to operate that way. And one of the most important and disturbing things about Trump has been the denial of that, the idea that it doesn't matter if states share our values. It doesn't matter if they're also liberal democracies. It makes no difference to us. Every state is just an entity of an exactly exchangeable and equivalent kind.
Just say one thing about AI, because I think it is probably the case that we're on the cusp of a world for which there aren't necessarily historical parallels, and that may be one aspect of it. And it seems at least possible that AI could really accelerate both of the trends that I mentioned earlier. That is, this is going to become a significantly less democratic world in the age of AI because of the ways in which that technology is owned and controlled, because of the ways in which questions of ownership will dictate questions of knowledge. And at the same time, this technology could be empowering for ordinary individuals in ways for which there is no parallel. It's at least conceivable that this technology will put into people's pockets opportunities to connect, to organize, to inform themselves in ways that haven't existed in the past. The thing that seems to me that's going to really struggle with this is the liberal democratic state. Now, in that old line, it's too big for the small problems, too small for the big problems. Well, in this case, it really does feel like the proportions are wrong. If it's trying to compete with that level of empowerment, it's going to lose. At the same time, if it's trying to take on the owners and controllers of this technology without controlling it itself, it is also going to lose. I'm not saying that means it's the end of everything, but that 200-year story of the liberal democratic state being empowered by crises, I think that's the thing that may be coming to an end.
Do you have any fear that the way things are going in America, America's going to be fighting itself, that the power bases are so great and so strong that the mandamis are actually going to have to take to the streets? Because what else can they do?
I'm struck by the similarity of the stories and the history that you've been explaining, led by strong men. And I am struck by the absence of women in leadership. And I would value your reflections on whether or not the death of democracy is disproportionately impacting women, or it does seem to me that there is an absence here of women.
We're not just fighting for concepts of democracy, but we have been losing faith and trust in politicians and politicians who can be relied upon to be accountable, and that money in politics is the driver of this. We've had some mention of, I've heard corruption once, and I've heard the mention of some big tech giants, but the systematic ability for money to buy politicians and to influence political agendas seems to me a really big part of our problems. And I just would like to hear a little bit more about that, please.
I think that's a very important point. The collapse of trust. It's a problem with many layers. It's happened across many domains of life. The collapse of trust in medical expertise and scientific methods and expertise in general in government. And one can argue about what brought this about. The COVID pandemic was part of the story, perhaps. The global financial crisis dealt a blow to people's respect for traditional financial institutions, and so on and so forth. But I think this is important. I think it connects with what David was saying about the sense of empowerment. For me, that sense of empowerment sometimes has some negative fallout. That when citizens become empowered through internet-based forms of publicness, that sometimes goes hand in hand with a collapse of trust, a collapse of deference. And deference can be a bad thing if deference is demanded and imposed, but deference can also be offered to people who've, for example, spent 12 years learning how to do surgery. You defer to them. You would never say, well, I'm going to go on the internet and find out how I want my heart to be operated on. So I think that collapse of trust is just another example of how many facets this current malaise has. It really is, in that sense, a polycrisis. The term is, now widely used, and I think it captures something of the fact that, we're not just dealing with one problem. We're dealing with many different interlocking symptoms of some larger syndrome.
You use the word deference, and I would use the word respect, because I think part of the rot that we're experiencing in society and in our institutions is that people have lost respect for us and respect for decency. And some of this, of course, is part of because we inhabit part of our lives in social media, where we hide behind our anonymity or hide behind our distance, and people are in their silos, and the abuse and the threats. And that, of course, is causing people who would have otherwise run for politics to say, that's not a life I want to lead. My family is being threatened. I'm at risk. So I think there is a general concern about the kind of the quality and the caliber of people who are willing to put themselves out there, and which leads to your question. And I think women in general, because while many people are getting abused on social media, I think the statistics are that women get abused more than men. And I recently had the opportunity to meet some young women who work within an organization called Elect Her, which is about trying to get more women into politics, which is also a battle about fighting misogyny, helping women to get ready for taking on these positions. And I don't have a gendered view of leadership. There are women and men who say, well, wouldn't it be a more peaceful world if there were more women leaders? I don't think the record holds up to that. I mean, Delcy Rodriguez in Venezuela is not a Democrat. Margaret Thatcher took this country into war. Questions raised about Aung San Suu Kyi. I'm not saying she's a warring person, but I do believe, and this is where my beliefs as a journalist come in, is that we're often defined by the questions we ask, the concerns we have, and it comes from who we are. And if we don't have more people from different backgrounds, different genders, asking questions, holding people accountable, then we're not going to have a society which finds the solutions and answers which are representative of the whole society. As great as the education is at Eton, if everyone comes from Eton, we'll have an Etonian kind of view on the world. And it goes back to what you're saying about memory and perception and, our own vision of what kind of society we want now. We're going to fight for it. But so, yes, we need more women. We need representation right across society if we're going to have a truly representative and a more democratic kind of society.
If we're worried about the future of gender equality, then I think a world of war where societies are increasingly militarized and the discussions are about armaments and defense and strategy is almost bound to be something that privileges men within that society. If we have societies where men go off to war and come back, or men are even being trained for war, I think that is also going to have an impact on these societies. I was going to say about corruption, I think we shouldn't beat around, but I mean, America is a deeply politically corrupt society where money buys politics. And we've seen now the most corrupt president by far in modern history. I think we have to reckon with how deeply impactful that is, not just around the world, but also for American people. And I think if we think about American democracy, I mean, they have prioritized certain things. They have asked their leaders for certain things in America, and they haven't received them. And so that is the basis of that distrust. And people connect that with the corruption in American politics, the corruption of money in American politics. And you asked, or someone asked about, where could America go in the coming months? And I think it could go in a very dark direction, depending on what happens around the elections, how confident Trump is in trying to maintain and consolidate his power, what kind of resistance and reactions there are. So I think these coming months are a turning point in that way. But let me just, go back to my main point, which is that however worried we are about that, and we should also be worried about the world unraveling in terms of war. And I'm not sure what could happen next. I would be most worried actually about the US. If there is a sense that this Iran endeavor war has gone well, what happens next to Cuba? What happens next to Greenland, to other countries? Canada. Having said that, I think, and because I know we're coming to an end, to go on a more positive note, I think, if things do turn around in some way, that the war in Iran does stop, and Trump is in some ways seen to have made a big mistake, and he pays a political price for that. If American politics pivots in a slightly different direction, then we're suddenly in a world of opportunity. And I think that's where we have to think big. And I think we have to think big in terms of these questions about democracy, but also in terms of this broader architecture of peace as well. And I think we lack right now the visionary leaders around these issues in the West as well as elsewhere.
We will post the link to the article I mentioned at the beginning in the LRB with the same title as this podcast from 10 years ago, if you would like to see if any of it still holds up, in our show description. Next time, it's another special live recording of PPF. This one in front of an audience made up of children from 3 schools in Oxford and 1 or 2 of their teachers and parents. And it's about a subject related to but different from the subject of today's episode. I'm going to be talking to the political historian and political scientist Adam Smith about the question of whether or not America seriously might be on the brink of another civil war. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.